Welcome back, everyone. We're continuing now with our lecture on Sufi practice. And I was talking as we closed the first part of this lecture about um, the saints' tombs and visitation to them as a Sufi practice. Uh, and in South Asia, especially in India and what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh, the tombs are supervised by a descendant of the saint. Again, monasticism was not practiced in Islam, and so many great Sufi spiritual leaders had ordinary married lives and had children. And the leading descendant in each generation was called the one who sits on the carpet of the shrine, the Sajjada Nashin. Um, these individuals were well respected in the surrounding community. Villagers would, of course, come and visit the shrine and meet with the shrine keeper. Uh, they were held in great regard by often by the ruling elite, and so sometimes they were given grants of land that would be worked by peasants, the proceeds of which would go to support the shrine and the shrine keeper. Because of this practice, in South Asia in particular, sometimes Sufi leaders became big landlords. And this is still the case in Pakistan, where land reform hasn't proceeded as far as in India. And then the peasants, the villagers in the surrounding area, would be not only the serfs of the shrine keeper, but also the spiritual followers of this individual. And for that reason, in Pakistan in particular, even in modern times, the Sajjada Nashins have emerged as sometimes a political force. Um, and of course, um, there's no such thing as a free lunch when the rulers or notables bestowed these land grants on the Sufi shrines. They expected the Sajjada Nashins then to support them politically. I mentioned that there was an annual festival for at Ajmer, and this is a picture of it for Moinuddin Chishti. These festivals in South Asia are called Urs, or a spiritual wedding. In the Mediterranean, they're more often called a Mawlid. In Egypt, for instance, these are ceremonies marking the birth of the saint that are attended by often hundreds of thousands of people. They're still very popular, and they're held all over the Muslim world still to this day. The, as I mentioned, there are forms of Islam that are more literalist, that have emerged in the past 300 years, that often have attacked Sufism as a spiritual tradition. Ibn Abdul Wahhab, the 18th century thinker in Saudi Arabia, or in Arabia, which then gradually became Saudi Arabia, denounced the idea of a mediator or intercessor between the divine and the human. In Wahhabism, human beings stand directly before God and are responsible only for themselves, can't expect any intercession from anybody else. And the Wahhabi tradition that developed in Arabia tended to see Sufi shrines as a form of idolatry, as a form of blasphemy, as sharing around God's divinity with mere mortals. And even within the Sunni tradition, where I would say probably most Sunnis in history have probably been Sufis, either belonged to the orders or were deeply influenced by the thought. In contemporary Sunnism, there's a strain called the Salafis who agree in this regard with the Wahhabis. And we've seen, for instance, in Libya, Salafi groups have been systematically destroying old Sufi shrines to make sure that they wipe out these practices. And since places like Libya are a mess, it may well be that they'll permanently alter the spiritual landscape in this way. In Sufism, there's a special devotion to the names of God, and it was thought in Muslim tradition that there are 99 special names of God that are properly objects of meditation. I'm showing you here the tomb of Mumtaz Mahal, a Mughal queen who was married to Shah Jahan in the 1600s, and on her tomb are written the 99 names of God. And among these names is merciful, the compassionate, the holy, the king, the peace. Sufis meditate on these names, often using a rosary, and recite the names. And they believe that this practice is salvific. And here I'm showing you a calligraphed tablet that has the 99 names on it. That's often placed on the wall of homes by pious Muslims. All Muslims are commanded to say the 5 daily prayers, which involve set recitation of certain phrases, as well as a certain amount of bowing and standing. But Sufis engage in extra prayers. These prayers are added on to the regular ones. So there are also seasonal prayers, prayers associated with certain actions. There are prayers to say when you wake up, when you go on a trip, for weddings and funerals. The supererogatory prayers, or the extra prayers, are said in the morning, the mid-morning, the early afternoon, after sunset, and after midnight. And staying up late praying is praised in the Quran. It was clearly a practice that was valued in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and it was thought that, it's quiet after midnight. The worries of everyday life have subsided. The household has gone to sleep, and so if somebody stays up praying after that, there's a kind of peace that descends. And so these prayers are thought to be especially efficacious. And in pre-modern times, before you had electricity and lights, night was often long, and people would go on to bed after the sun set, and wouldn't get up until dawn. And so frequently it was the case that people would sleep 3 or 4 hours and then wake up in the middle. They might even get up and eat something or hang out with friends, and then they would go back to sleep. And so Sufis would take advantage of that midnight interregnum to say extra prayers. Just reverting to some of the themes of our course, it's important to underline that there has been some psychological study of Muslims at prayer, and there is a correlation that has been found in some studies between regular prayer and a sense of subjective well-being, that is self-reported well-being on scales that are given. Psychologists have reported that Muslims use religiosity as a common strategy to cope with life problems. a coping strategy in psychology is defined as the ways an individual, group, or organization um, use to minimize the effects of stress. So, religion, prayer, turning to the divine are all uh, associated with well being, and this is true across religions. It's not only Muslims that are reporting this, but also American Christians, for instance. Um, Coping strategies involve realism. So, in order for a stress to be coped with, it has to be acknowledged. And we all have stress. As I'm teaching this course, the world is being stressed by a pandemic. Um, and so stress cannot be avoided. But the question is how one responds to it. And stress varies not only with the time and the situation, but also in individuals across time. So, attitude is important in dealing with stress. Some people feel stress more than others do. We mentioned the 5 kinds of personality, and that people with a high degree of neuroticism or emotional volatility have more trouble dealing with stress. But the findings are that regular prayer and worship are associated with well being. Um, Muslims make use of reliance on trust in God, and that's sometimes been criticized by some authors as a sort of fatalism. I don't think that that's fair because Muslims as a civilization haven't been more fatalistic than anybody else. They've gone out and created science and culture and been active. But an attitude of reliance on God, which is called tawakkul, is prized among pious Muslims as a strategy for managing challenging events in life. And trust in God implies I think, for pious Muslims, the idea of sharing the burdens of life with God, that one is not on one's own, that uh, there is a divine being that cares about the individual. And this sharing of responsibility is found by some psychologists. There was a study done in Malaysia, for instance. Uh, it finds that it is associated with positive feelings of relief and safety. Um, it's not a principle, tawakkul or reliance on God, is not a principle of laziness or not doing anything. And in fact, there's a famous saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad uh, that someone came to him and said that he had depended on God and hadn't bothered to tie up his camel when he got off of it, and the camel had wandered off. And the man was complaining to the Prophet that his piety hadn't been rewarded. The Prophet is said to have replied, "Well, trust in God, but tie your camel." And when I lived in the Middle East, had Muslims often quote this to me. This principle of reliance on God does not relieve the individual of the responsibility for acting responsibly. Um, some empirical studies then have noted that reliance on God, this tawakkul, seems to be an effective strategy among people who adopt it for reducing their anxiety and for gaining hope. And we talked earlier in the class that constant anxiety, long-term anxiety, is very bad for you. It produces a kind of natural steroid that interferes then with the production of those hormones that make for a feeling of well-being and happiness. Uh, and so anything that actually reduces anxiety is probably good for a person. And there's a sense also of hope in reliance as the Sufis practice it. And again, hope is highly correlated with well-being. If people don't have a sense of hope, then it's easy to get depressed. So various kinds of spiritual practice and prayer have been found by some psychologists working in Muslim countries to be associated with reduced stress. There are various kinds of prayers. Prayer, we just have the one word in English of prayer, but there are many kinds of prayer in Muslim practice. A supplication to God is called a dua. Practicing prayerful patience or sabr is another worship practice. Uh, in the Quran, there's a verse that says patience is beautiful, and I can't tell you how many times I've had people in the Middle East quote that to me, especially when I was being impatient about something. Um, there's remembrance of God or zikr. We've talked about it's spelled, it was sometimes transliterated zikr, sometimes thikr, depending on the language from which it's being transliterated. There's remembrance of God, and Sufis, of course, engage in this practice of remembrance or recitation of names of God, for instance. Um, and then Sufis are encouraged to be aware of the presence of death, that life is fleeting and therefore cannot be all important. It's not that one should be morbid and be thinking about death, but just to give everything a sense of proportion. Um, it should be remembered that life doesn't last forever. And finally, there's a reflective recitation of the Quran. It's very important in Muslim practice. Again, all of these have been associated in scales that have been given to Muslims with reduced anxiety and increased